Anthony, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome. As far as Georgia's grand jury process, how does that work next week? Very quickly, kind of give our viewers some idea of what that looks like. And if I'm in the courthouse, which I will be, what are the hallmarks of a true bill being returned? What should I be looking for?
So in Georgia right now, we're in Fulton County. We have two grand juries that meet. One meets on Monday and Tuesday, and another grand jury meets on Thursday and Friday. So we could expect Fani Willis to present to one of those two juries. It'll probably take 2 full days for the amount of evidence that she has to be presented to one of those grand juries. So we can probably expect an indictment by all accounts either on Tuesday or Friday, although anything is possible. And of course, the Fulton County courthouse procedures are a little different than in the federal courthouse and the federal system. We don't have a sealed indictment process. What will essentially happen is the indictment will be brought into court and read into the court record in public. And so we will pretty quickly, almost in real time, know what the grand jury decided once they do make a decision.
Okay, so I want you to law geek with me a little bit because I know you and I are kind of the same ilk. There is some speculation that Fani Willis could deploy Georgia's RICO Act, the Racketeering Act, against Trump and several of his allies. Now, RICO hasn't been used in an election law setting before. So in your opinion, Professor, what would be the proper application of Georgia's RICO statute in this particular instance?
Well, what we have in the aftermath of the 2020 election is a really difficult conspiracy, and perhaps we could call it a series of conspiracies. And it's really hard, I think, for the law to, in a kind of traditional sense, apply the law of conspiracy because all the different actors here in Georgia didn't necessarily have an overt agreement about what they were precisely doing. And so the Georgia RICO statute essentially allows the DA to yoke all these different actors together and to show that they were acting for a common unlawful criminal purpose, and they created a criminal enterprise to overturn the election, even though all the different people in the machine didn't know what role they were exactly playing. So the Georgia RICO statute, it's much broader than the federal statute. It is a law that is often used by the Fulton County District Attorney's Office in a variety of settings beyond the kind of violent crime, mobster, kinds of, settings that people generally think of RICO as applying to.
So, Anthony, let's then talk about that. Let's drill down a little bit, right? Should we expect to see one indictment with Donald Trump and several co-defendants, several indictments with maybe individual or maybe one, maybe two defendants? And I wanted to ask you, reporting a few months ago was that some of these targets for Fani Willis, they got immunity deals. Does an immunity deal impact whether or not they eventually end up looking at an indictment themselves?
So I think what we will see is a large number of co-defendants in one singular indictment. I think at the end of the day, Fani Willis will probably go a slightly different path than the special counsel has and really rope in all the co-defendants together in one proceeding or one indictment and at least start that way. Of course, cases could be severed down the road. I think the other thing that's essential to recognize here is that because of the severity of RICO and the punishments that come with a RICO charge, in addition to the traditional election law violations, there might be a significant incentive for a number of the people who aren't really at the top of the food chain to provide evidence and to flip and secure deals with the DA. And so that will also affect the process going forward. So I do think we're going to see a very large sweeping indictment with multiple co-defendants, and we'll have to see exactly who those people are. But we do know that a number of the fake electors did secure immunity deals. Partially, I suspect that's because they have information that would be useful to the district attorney, and because some of those individuals, it might be very well hard to show the kind of criminal intent necessary to successfully prosecute them.
So, Anthony, Donald Trump up early this morning attacking Fani Willis on social media. I'm not going to read or show what he wrote on Truth Social because it's just him blabbering as usual. But he did put one thing out there that I think you and I would be interested in. He said, quote, as president, challenging election fraud, my duty and right, end quote. Put it to bed for us, Professor of Law Anthony Michael Kreis. Is there a right legally for Donald Trump to do what he did or as alleged to have done in this particular instance?
Absolutely not. What happened here in Georgia in 2020 was clearly, I think, a criminal, and it certainly was not lawful. What happened in Georgia was we had a good, transparent, fair, honest election. The votes were counted not just one time, but 3 times, in fact, and there was an additional matching process to ensure that mail-in ballots weren't fraudulent. Georgia went through every single possible mechanism and triggered every possible mechanism that was lawfully available to ensure that the votes were accurately counted and that the winner of the election, the true winner of the election, Joe Biden, was certified. By the time Donald Trump started to meddle in Georgia, particularly when he called Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and asked for 11,000 votes and change, there was no lawful way to change the outcome of that election. The demand he made of the Secretary of State was patently unlawful, and I think that that's really going to be the key piece of evidence that lands Donald Trump in significant trouble here in Fulton County.
Anthony, I got less than a minute. I'm going to pull up on your screen. Yesterday on social media, you wrote, Donald Trump will not see the inside of the Fulton County Jail. You wrote some other stuff, and unfortunately, I don't have enough time to get to it. But I do want to ask you, why are you saying that Donald Trump will not see the inside of the Fulton County Jail?
Well, I think there's two aspects of it. A lot of people think that Donald Trump will get booked just like every other criminal defendant here in Fulton County. I think that's just not realistic. I don't think the Secret Service is going to allow Donald Trump to be brought into the Fulton County Jail. And there are some rumors that seem to circulate that people think he might be subject to pretrial detention in the Fulton County Jail, and that's just not in the works. So, certainly he could face prison time at the end of the day if he's convicted. I think there is a very good chance that he will be convicted here in Fulton County, given the strength of the evidence. But he will not be spending time in the Fulton County Jail anytime in the near future.
Professor Anthony Michael Kreis, you got to come back. We got to go through the case as it develops once that indictment is released and unveiled, I'll call it, or revealed to the public. We got to go through that, and then we'll go through the process. Thanks for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you.